right, so joining us now in the studio is Liz Wahl. Thank you so much for being here.
Nice to be here.
It's over a year. What is it like watching this video for you now?
I try not to watch it because it brings back memories of that chaotic time. But I don't have any regrets watching it all this time, especially having witnessed or, having seen the way things have played out on the ground in Ukraine. I think we can all pretty much confidently say that Russian media has indeed been instrumental in manipulating the information space when it comes to Ukraine. So I'm glad that I took action at the time that I did, and hopefully brought attention to the issue in one form or another, and get people kind of interested and I guess aware of the role that Russia plays in today's news and geopolitical
Well, and you've had an
climate.
interesting arc, because I mean, in your statement with what you were saying, it had personal elements with your Hungarian heritage and discussing
Yes.
that. But since then, I mean, you've gone on to become, an expert, someone who speaks more generally about what this new style of Russian propaganda is, and speaking in front of Congress. But I mean, I was curious, since we're dealing with this one-year anniversary of the shooting down of MH17, I mean, what is your take on how RT or other Russian media, how have they covered that? What sort of a narrative have they tried to present?
Right. Well, I think that the way that the Russian media is covering even the one-year anniversary is just consistent with the way that they cover news in general, especially when it comes to Ukraine. I remember at the time when the plane was shot down, immediately I was thinking, oh, I wonder how they're going to spin this. And it didn't take too long for several competing theories to come out of Russian media. Some of them being really far-fetched, that it was the first missing Malaysian Airlines already carrying dead bodies. I mean, that's the extreme end of conspiracy. But the one that was got a lot of play right away was that it was targeting a plane that President Putin was flying on, and the one I think that they were tried to make the most plausible was that it was actually the Ukrainians that were responsible. So again, it goes back to the strategy: blame Ukraine, always blame the Ukrainians when it comes to covering the war in Ukraine.
And I mean, when you would work for RT, they do seem to kind of change their position on different issues at times. I mean, as someone who worked there, how would that happen? Would there be different guidelines, or just suddenly something new would come down?
Right. Well, as the evidence comes out that is not favorable to the Kremlin, then you have to change your narrative, okay? If you say that there's no little green men on the ground, they don't exist, they're not there, well, if news reports come out that that's not the case, we have video evidence, we have eyewitness accounts, we have, whatever, documents, whatever, there's proof, well then you have to shift your position and say, oh, well, they're peacekeeping forces, and then it's kind of going with, and you're right, it's bizarre, and it's not necessarily that they're trying to convince the audience of a particular position all the time, but simply, I think, seeing it firsthand and following it, it's more of just trying to stir confusion so that people don't really know what's going on.
Yeah, but don't you think that it's a part of the strategy? What we see with the MH17, new versions coming up. So as much information as possible, as many information as possible, as many versions as possible. Don't you think that is exactly part of the strategy to feel confused and to feel that the situation is too complicated to understand something?
Exactly the strategy, and I think it's an effective strategy because again. And you got to think, and they know the way, especially, it's relevant in today's media climate because news, we're on Twitter, working in journalism, and everybody's, it's by the minute, by the second. But if they put out competing theories right away, it takes a while for Western journalists that want to find out the facts to actually debunk it. And so they're going to put out that narrative right away, and by the time that it's debunked, it's already that initial impression, and first impressions matter, and I think Russian media knows that, and so I think that, and I'm seeing it because I've done some traveling throughout Europe, Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, and you really feel this frustration and exasperation with how do you deal with this menacing.
This is exactly what the most interesting part. What's the influence? How does it work? And whether people do really whether they are caught into this, into this vicious circle of information circling around. How does it work in the United States? How whether people are really watching, believing, and following.
Right. Okay. And this is where it gets strange or kind of complicated, because people ask, well, who actually believes in these crazy alternative theories that Russia puts out, that Russian media puts out? You know, they give a platform to 9/11 truthers, some other far-fetched conspiracy theories. And I came to realize, and from my story and my experience in actually being a target of Russian media, the way that it does work. For example, when I had resigned, there were theories that they put out about me, about who I am, that I was a CIA agent, that it was, you know, all a self-promotional stunt. And one that really stuck was that I was a neocon, part of this greater conspiracy theory, a greater conspiracy to ignite another Cold War. And this one really stuck, and it was tweeted over and over again by RT correspondents, and this following that they have that really, and they use these words, you know, if you are against the Russian narrative, you're either a neo-Nazi or a neocon.
They get you on both ends.
So they use these kinds of words to brand you. And is it effective? Well, yes, because spammed by the Russian trolls and the sympathizers that maybe aren't the paid trolls, and being like, oh, you know, you're a fraud. I mean, some expletive words that I can't say right here on, you know, on the air, and it works, and it mobilizes them, and so, you know, it becomes a controversy, and it becomes, there's a narrative out there about even me, and I'm using this as just because I feel like it's a microcosm of the way that it works, is that, you know, and my Wikipedia page was all this one source. It was controlled, and it takes a while. It took a few weeks for it to correct itself.
Which is the same thing you're talking about, that then that first version has come out and people believe that, even if it's corrected later.
And then all of a sudden, it's like, well, maybe she was controlled by a neocon organization. Maybe she was, you know, maybe
which is what I want to bring it back to, because
which is with Ukraine.
Yeah.
Who knows who's responsible?
Yeah.
Who knows who fired those shots? It's always competing theories. And
I just want to quote you, because you said it really well. I mean, what you're talking about is, other people have spoken about it too, the wrecking of the information space. And I just wanted to quote part of what you had said to Congress. We'll play a brief video of you, but I'll read it here. It says, the Russian bosses say that the organization is simply providing another perspective, one that is ignored in Western media. The implication there is that there is no such thing as objective truth. But let us not get duped falsehood. Someone is responsible for pulling the trigger that killed Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov. Someone is responsible for launching the Buk missile that downed MH17, killing all 298 passengers on board. And what I found so powerful about that is, if you make it all relative, you lose any accountability or any sort of real pain or suffering.
Yes, and that's definitely a strategy that is used by Russian media. The editor-in-chief of Margarita Simonyan had said herself that there is no such thing as an objective truth. And I think on the surface it sounds like a really enlightened position, that, oh, you know, there's a perspective, everything is just a matter of perspective. But
which sounds good.
It sounds really good. You know, you have a viewpoint, but then it gets a little strange, and it gets a little funky when you put crazy people on that have no interest in the truth, and then you say that their viewpoint is just as relevant as somebody else that is really interested in seeking the truth. And yeah, it manipulates this idea of moral relativism, and it really manipulates that. And the way that Western media works, you know, we try, there's standards in the newsroom, you know, to try to credit your sources, fact check, stuff like that. Whereas in Russian media, it's those kinds of checks and balances aren't there. So it's more enforce the narrative. How do you do that? Well, you know, we'll ignore certain things, we'll deny certain things, and then if it gets twisted enough, I mean, lie, essentially.
So it takes time for someone in the newsroom to understand what is happening really, because you were not obviously the only one who is.
Well,
that leads us to a question maybe a little bit about HR strategy. Who is really working there? Who is seeking job at RT, and who is believing in that job, and, you know, working principally.
Right. So I would say it's a spectrum. I worked at RT America, so the bureau was in Washington, D.C. So a majority, interestingly, of the employees were American there. They have, you know, other bureaus in London and elsewhere, so Western journalists. And when it comes to reporters, you know, for the newscast, they want, this, to have some kind of basis in truth. So that's the thing. You can make a lot of news stories, and I did a bunch that I thought were worthwhile. You can do stories that make the West look bad and have it be 100% true, because we do have our own problems.
And especially Occupy Wall Street. I mean, from being from New York and my friends who are in New York, at the time there was a lot of positive, feedback. The fact that you and others, that they were giving press coverage to something that wasn't being covered elsewhere, and that colored a lot of people's reception of RT later on.
They were happy to see RT. I remember we covered it for quite, very in depth for a long time. And when we arrived with our green microphone, we were welcomed. they were glad to see us because they knew that we were, that we would cover them fairly.
But I mean, coming back to this, what is the ethical issue? Because I don't know as much about the DC bureau. There are articles written about the journalists that were sought for the Moscow bureau, often from the UK, fresh out of their degree program, not speaking Russian, no experience there. Basically, people they could take advantage of. So by the time that they realized what was going on, they'd already had them for a while, and they could replace them with new people. But what are the ethical questions for journalists? I mean, how in a difficult market with not a lot of jobs, how do people deal with that?
Right. And I think they're going to have an increasingly difficult time recruiting Western journalists. I would think with a lot of the fallout that had happened as a result of the coverage of Ukraine and I guess resignations that have exposed it to some extent. Another thing that, yes, that's true. And so, if some of the journalists are fresh and they want to impress their bosses, well then you have some instances where the journalist can be molded, and if you don't ask the right questions, well, then you're going to be the soft power. You're going to be punished. You're not going to be put on stories. You're not going to get a raise. Things like that. Life is going to be difficult for you. However, if you push the line, if you don't push, the wrong buttons, if you really play to that Kremlin narrative, you're going to advance very quickly. So if you are okay with that, life is going to be pretty good there. So there's that kind of camp, and there's that way that it happens. So as a result, there's this strong level of self-censorship that happens. In the morning meeting, just to not pitch that story, not ask that question. Otherwise, it's going to be a really long, awkward silence, and the Russian bosses are not going to be happy.
You're that much farther away from the raise or the trip or whatever it is.
But then another way that they are able to get journalists or commentators is actually actively recruiting people that come from a fringe background or a conspiratorial background. So, there's people that tend to be very conspiratorial, and, one of the hosts that they hired was a very staunch 9/11 truther, and she comes from this kind of background. I don't want to implicate anybody specifically, that has that way of thinking that the West is corrupt, that, that the U.S. is just trying to take over the world. And it sounds crazy.
Sounds like an attractive idea.
Exactly. But there's people that believe in that, and they're given a platform. And
disproportionately.
that believe in that are given a platform.
But to change, that'll be the last question for me, but an interesting one. Since you've moved into this role of explaining it and trying to explain this, propaganda war, whatever people want to call it, what has the reception been? How have people received you? And, I feel like maybe I'm being a little biased, but maybe some of the people you're explaining it to are older politicians, older executives who don't have the best grasp of internet or some of the media.
Right. I think when this had first happened, when I had resigned, there wasn't really an understanding as to how effective and how manipulative and media can be used to manipulate a war in this situation of conflict. But I'm seeing as time went on that there was increasing interest. We heard one of the top leaders of NATO saying this is one of the greatest information blitzes that we've seen ever. And leaders, in the Baltic states and elsewhere, Eastern Europe, really acknowledging the effectiveness of this kind of propaganda. And of course, in Congress, in U.S. Congress, we just by that hearing before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs showed that there is now this interest and response and this, at least this feeling that we need to do something to counter it, to take it seriously. So I'm seeing that as the conflict had played out, that there's political, military journalists all over the world, specifically, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, the surrounding regions that are affected by the conflict, more or less sanctions or possibility of it spreading elsewhere, and of course the more muscle flexing from Russia. So you're seeing a growing interest in it and desire to do something about it, so that hopefully we can amplify
Respond in a way.
the truth, and so that this menacing, disinformation that's coming out from the outlets and this troll
To
war
counter
and
it.
all of this, that we can fight it.
Well, I think I have to end it there, but thank you so much for coming on and talking to us.